morning and welcome to Rising. We've been working very hard on planning a fantastic show for you today. And when I say we, I mean the fine folks who help write, script, find guests, etc. We got a couple really good guests today. We haven't had a lot of guests lately.
No, but we are more than making up for it with a roster today.
Yes, we don't have to hear the sound of each other's voice quite as much today.
Let's get some fresh faces in here, Robby.
All right, what's on deck?
Well, up first, former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows reportedly took the stand in a Georgia courthouse yesterday, where he lobbied the judge to move his charges from state to federal court. Meadows has been charged, along with former President Trump and 17 other alleged co-conspirators, in relation to their push to overturn the state's 2020 election results. Now, the judge has yet to issue a ruling on the venue change, but should the case turn federal, Meadows can assert immunity and get the counts dismissed. To switch courts, Meadows must convince the judge he was a federal officer acting under the color of such office. Meadows reportedly said on the stand yesterday, "I don't know that I did anything that was outside my scope as chief of staff."
Now, over on CNN, the former chief of staff to Mike Pence explained why he doesn't see that legal argument cutting it.
I think that it's probably true that Mark was acting at the behest of the president, and I think he does deserve the benefit of the doubt there as far as what he was doing. But I do think one challenge for him is to say this is all my official capacity. If that was true, then why was he circumventing all of White House counsel's advice? Why wasn't Pat Cipollone involved? Why wasn't that team involved? Why wasn't DOJ involved? Instead, Mark recruited outside lawyers who he wanted to listen to. And so I think that undercuts the notion that this was all part of my federal responsibility if I'm not getting counsel from the people who are hired into your office to serve the White House in that role.
It is very interesting to hear the perspective of Mike Pence's chief of staff, someone who, you know, whatever you think of his politics, or if you think that Mike Pence should have gone along with the scheme and all of those kinds of things, is the most analogous position to Mark Meadows to weigh in on whether or not he was acting in the scope of his responsibilities. What do you make of the argument that if he were really acting in the scope of his responsibilities, he wouldn't have cut out so many official White House staff and staffers and lawyers who were giving contrary advice to what he and this increasingly narrow team of co-conspirators were doing?
Yeah, this is where the Hatch Act comes into play, because government employees can't engage in partisan political activity while also doing their official capacity. Obviously, in reality, that distinction is pretty messy and pretty slippery, and probably technically violated here and by a lot of other government officials in a lot of other roles. So yes, I think the argument that Mark Short was making there is probably a good counter argument. At the same time, you know, I read, I obviously didn't watch the hearing, but read the Washington Post report of what Mark Meadows was arguing during the hearing. And look, again, he is, you know, entitled to a presumption of innocence. What he's saying is that, look, I participated in these calls. I had no choice but to participate in these calls as chief of staff. I wanted to he said I wanted to verify that, you know, I wasn't pushing the election was stolen agenda. I was trying to verify that everything was kosher so we could have a transfer of power, and I had to be part of these calls, but I was not furthering some scheme. And I had some questions, a lot of other things I didn't agree with. I was not furthering some scheme to prevent the transfer of power from taking place, but rather the opposite. Again, it's the government, the people prosecuting him have to make the case that that's not true. He went beyond that and was actually part of some scheme to deny the election. He says that he was working in his official capacity to verify everything so that the transfer of power could take place and we could have faith in the election.
Yeah, I mean, I do think the problem with that is the choice to not listen to the most official Trump-hired attorneys within the Trump administration. To, you know, when you read the indictment, there was a threat to fire more attorneys that was only stopped by the rest of the Justice Department, basically saying if they go, I go. The cherry picking of legal advice suggests not genuine ignorance of what the overwhelming thrust of legal analysis was telling you it was true. but a choice to have a certain outcome and to find lawyers that would enable that choice. So you go from having your entire, again, this is during the Trump administration. This isn't a liberal scheme to the extent that Trump didn't like the people who were around him. It's because he made bad hiring decisions, and from his own perspective. But they were all, person after person after person was telling him it was fine to investigate allegations of fraud. It's your responsibility even to investigate allegations of fraud or any evidence of fraud. But when we found none, we're telling you we have found none, you lost this election. And to go from all of those kind of esteemed attorneys within your own administration to relying on basically Rudy Giuliani, who is now your co-conspirator, as one of the few attorneys who are willing to tell you what you want to hear, I do think that is an increasingly less credible argument. There was this other argument that the Washington Post charts out what happened in this testimony, that the Trump campaign was suing Raffensperger at the time, and it was being characterized as a settlement negotiation. We weren't trying to influence the election on the call with Raffensperger. I was doing this in furtherance of the settlement negotiation. And at this point, the judge, the Washington Post writes, appeared skeptical of that argument and asked their own question, saying, was there any discussion of settlement negotiation on the call? And Raffensperger replied, no. So I don't know. My bigger question of this is twofold. One, I think the question of whether or not he's going to be able to get into federal court is an interesting one because it sets a precedent for all of the other people in the case. And part of the value from the prosecutor's perspective is the state charges not having the same ability of Trump to pardon people. So you're going to be able to get people to flip more easily if you keep it in state court. So there's one thing that's interesting.
Well, and a lot of it is protected if it goes to federal court.
Yeah.
Because then he can argue it was,
and
national
the scope
security.
Of his, yeah. The second question is whether or not having these increasingly detailed conversations about the character of the alleged scheme is going to start to penetrate the national consciousness in a way that broad hand-waving to the riot on 1/6 doesn't seem to have changed many people's minds about whether Trump himself was culpable as opposed to random people in a crowd who might have been driven by ops or what have you. Right.
Or I guess, it could make people even more alarmed of the scope of this indictment, that it is, not actually rigorously focused on verifiably criminal action or actually acts, but just conversations that people were part of, including Mark Meadows. Reading what he has to say and his participation of the call, his participation in this call. Again, maybe there's a lot of other stuff. Maybe he was talking to people in other contexts that more obviously involve wrongdoing. But if I'm just weighing in or reflecting on Mark Meadows' role in this one call, this doesn't look like enough for a criminal indictment to me. But
that's interesting. I think there's a lot more. And I know that watching conservative media, there is no engagement with the idea that if you were looking for fraud, if you thought there were fraud and you thought that the vote tally was wrong because of fraud, I think the question would be asking Raffensperger, well, how many votes with this, what is going on there? How many votes of this nature that don't match up? Tell me what the numbers are. You tell me what the evidence is. The idea of calling somebody up and saying, find me the votes. I know we've talked about this ad nauseum, but I have a really hard time imagining that is a choice of words that one would use when you think that there's some unknown number of votes out there that the experts in the state need to go through, versus I don't care what you do, I don't care what it takes, come up with a gap between me and Biden so that we can say that I won this state.
Right. I think I don't know, he has to make his defense for that. He'll say that he was told or he was informed, again, by people who are not credible. This is not a question of whether he's right or not. He's clearly not right. That he had actually won by that many votes and that they were out there and they'd not been counted.
Well, no, he didn't say, I think I won. I'm being told that I won by 1,532 votes. So why aren't you counting those votes? He says, I'm currently losing by 1,542. That's not the real number, obviously, but 1,542 votes. So find me 1,543 votes.
He's saying you have to find at least that many to demonstrate that the person who actually won this state has won it, from his view.
You have to find votes that there's no evidence of having been cast. That's the problem.
There is no evidence, but again, it goes down to
but
his
this is the
sincere
thing.
belief that they did exist
imagine
based
the
on bad advice he
conversation.
got.
There's a conversation about, like, I see these votes were cast. These votes weren't counted because of hanging Chad. These votes weren't counted because we found them in a dustbin and a trash can. Like, point to the evidence that there are votes that weren't counted and be arguing about why those should be counted, but that wasn't the nature of the conversation.
Well, I mean, but him and his surrogates, they were doing that. It's just that they're saying, "Oh, look at this video of ballots being taken. Yes. This is an uncounted," and right, none of that panned out.
Right,
but you can't say they weren't pointing to actual things.
But I'm talking about what happened in the call. To the extent that he brought up some of those things, Raffensperger and pointed out, there's no evidence that happened. That isn't true. Raffensperger has said in many times since then, there was no evidence of any of that being true. So if you're being told that, but again, this isn't a big liberal hoax by your own, like, Republican electeds in various states across the country who have also testified that they would have much preferred that Donald Trump win the election. They didn't like being put in this position, but the reality was he just didn't. So now Donald Trump and his co-conspirators have to explain why they would not have taken the own advice of their own counsel and every expert that was investigating fraud, all the lawsuits that they filed across the country to try to make this come out in their favor. They were going to ignore all of that and put persistent pressure on. Remember, Raffensperger recorded this call because it was not the first of the calls that he had gotten from the Trump administration where they had been leaning on him to change the election result, to find votes. So,
I mean, the government has to prove that what they were doing was in furtherance of with awareness that they had lost the election as part of a conspiracy to prevent the transfer of power to Joe Biden with actual with the forging of documents or the assembling of fake electors or all that stuff. The government has to prove that. Them just being wrong, manifestly wrong, like super wrong about what happened in the election is not enough.
And there's a lot of that other stuff too, including in the context of this Raffensperger call, threats of the kind that the Virgin Islands representative made toward Matt Taibbi, that you could face, Trump threatened Raffensperger, saying you could face criminal charges for being wrong about this, not agreeing with me about this particular issue. So, of course, we'll continue to follow this and see how that all pans out. Stick around. We have more Rising for you right after this.